how you remember things. What do you want and what do you remember? Every moment in life, right, you are positioned between your memories and your will or plans, right?
Yeah.
You're always at that little interface in the present. And, what is doing the magic is not you, it's your neurons.
I'm John Fox, Director of the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience here at the University of Rochester, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Neuroscience Perspectives. Please give us a like or a follow wherever you get your podcasts or videocasts. Our guest today has pioneered a way to record from individual neurons in the human brain, which is transforming our understanding of processes like memory and behavior. Dr. Itzhak Fried is a world-class neuroscientist and a neurosurgeon who has completed more than 1,000 epilepsy surgeries. He is professor of neurosurgery, psychiatry and behavioral sciences and co-director of the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles Seizure Disorder Center at the UCLA School of Medicine. Itzhak has won numerous awards, including the Ramon Cajal Award, the Mundinger Award, and the Tsubokawa Award. Not so easy for me to say. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'd really like to welcome Itzhak here to the University of Rochester. Itzhak, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Let's dive into your research really quickly. You're currently working on solutions to prevent or preserve memory. I mean, an extraordinary thing in a time with Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative diseases is so prominent in people's minds. Can you talk about the idea of memory prosthetics?
Well, memory prosthetic is probably still a vision for the future, but the idea is really not so much to prevent memory loss, but actually to try and enhance it or really selectively improve it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can think about it sort of as a hearing aid, like we have hearing aid to boost our hearing. Right. Why won't we have something to boost our memory? And the idea is, of course, that we are looking at a cognitive tsunami, in a sense, with aging population and a lot of individuals worldwide, suffering from memory decline and cognitive decline in general. Okay, so I think in trying to treat neurological disorder, in the motor sphere, we presently have some solutions, mainly through deep brain stimulation.
Right.
But trying to really modulate, other circuits in the brain, in the cognitive domain, in the memory domain, is really more challenging, and I think that's sort of a goal or a vision that we have. Yeah.
This is the extraordinary part of your work, right? Is you literally get to work in human brain tissue, alive in front of you, often awake, and you're putting electrodes in. We know, for our viewers, that if we put electrodes in to folks with motor disorders like Parkinson's disease and turn them on or pass a little bit of current, we can make a difference. We can affect things. And the idea is to take that basic principle and apply it to the circuits for memory in a brain that's deteriorating from a memory perspective.
The bottom line is the language of the brain is electricity. Mm-hmm. And in order to really modulate it, we need to really understand how those systems work, at least to understand to some extent, and then trying to really interfere specifically.
Right.
So, this opportunity to work, with the human brain is, of course, unique in the sense that you get insights and you get possibilities which do not exist really in, let's say, animal research on the one hand,
right,
and also do not exist in so-called non-invasive tools to really study the brain, such as fMRI or recording, from the scalp. So
right.
It's a small window of opportunity that is done in a careful clinical environment that you can address questions which you really cannot address in any other way.
Right. Now, going back to this idea, with movement disorders, right? These electrodes are placed by folks like yourself very specifically in specific centers of the brain. But there's been a lot of news out there with, tech billionaires, trillionaires placing electrodes and maybe having chronic indwelling electrodes. Give us your position on that. I mean, do you see it?
Yeah, you are really, you are moving into extreme, sides of this field, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the idea to modulate a motor is relatively easy in a sense that you can see the results immediately, right? If a Parkinson patient, has a tremor,
right,
or some rigidity, and you stimulate or inject current into a certain area like the subthalamic nucleus, you can suddenly see, almost an immediate changes. Yeah. Sometimes you can see it in the operating room. The patient is awake and there's a tremor, and you apply current, and suddenly the tremor stops. This is a wonderful thing to actually see it. And I've had, for instance, a patient who was a violinist, and she developed essential tremor, a tremor, so she could no longer play the violin, and of course became a violin teacher, So she could teach, but she couldn't actually play the violin. And I took her to the operating room with a violin, right? And there is a moment that we injected that current to that specific place or point in the brain. She could, for the first time, she said, I can now control, so.
That must have been an extraordinary moment.
This is a wonderful result, but it's a relatively easy problem, right? Yeah. Now, when you reach a cognitive domain, it's much more, difficult, and that's what I was trying to do for many years, to understand that system, better, and then hone in on a certain circuits, which we know is critical, sort of the hub, the memory hub of the brain, the hippocampus.
Right. There's a key insight there, which is that those motor circuits are extremely well understood. I must tell you one thing. They're not extremely well understood. Good.
In fact, there is a trade-off in medicine and science, okay? If we would have waited until, we would completely understand the motor system, we probably would have done nothing, really. I mean, for instance, a disorder like dystonia, which is a horrible, disabling situation, and I don't think we fully understand, the motor circuits, but for some reason, when people try to inject current, into the globus pallidus internum, you could see sometimes miraculous results, maybe without full understanding yet of the system.
But you did at least know to go to the globus
at least
pallidus internus,
where to go, and many observations are sometimes done, incidentally by accident. For instance, a big insight into the role of the basal ganglia in Parkinson, was by Cooper, many years ago, where he, by accident, did an operation and he injured a certain artery. And after that injury, actually, that patient who happened to have also Parkinsonian symptoms got better.
Goodness me.
So that actually lesion was, and from this, got into pallidotomy and later deep brain stimulation. So, it's a long process. But I think we felt like we had an opportunity to really get down to the level of the neurons, what's called the atoms of cognition, really. These are the atoms, really. I think the most critical level, of neuronal function is the way that your, tech billionaires who are trying to, implant 1,000 little threads in one area. This is a way to actually get information from the brain and use it to actually improve function.
Right. Not to belabor this, but could you imagine a time in a matter of, let's say, a decade or so, where this would not be unusual at all, right? We do have folks going around with cochlear implants now. There would have been a time nobody would have known what that was,
Absolutely.
and now people would see them quite.
Yeah.
We have people with deep brain stimulators in. Where are we heading? I mean, what does the next 10, 20 years look like?
The cochlear implant is really, a very good model, and I think we are going in this way. I think, those efforts should be directed to specific clinical situations, where you can insert, or find ways to get information from the brain and use that information. For instance, there's this whole area of brain-machine interfaces for people who are paralyzed, or even people who now, cannot speak because of a motor disconnection lower in the system. These ways of bypassing, a disconnection and moving directly from the brain to outside, whether it's a cursor on a computer or a robotic arm, this technology has become, had tremendous improvements over the last decade, and now I think with artificial intelligence algorithms can be incredible, really. So the whole principle is information. And how much information can you get in, and how much information can you manipulate and modulate?
And you're taking the richness of the neuronal patterns in a given area and then doing some dimensionality reduction to produce some motor responses. Something like that.
So these people have gotten pretty good at this, and this
and of course AI in that interim layer has made a big difference.
That's not just an incremental change. That's a paradigm change. In a way.
Not to get too much into the weeds here, but there are limitations, right? The electrode technology, in terms of how long an electrode can stay in human brain tissue and stay good and still read without scarring and things like that. Can you speak to that?
I think that, many of the electrodes, at the level of neurons, there is some, gliosis or scarring process that is limited. But the newer technology, that is placed in the brain, I don't think we have enough of a long-term follow-up.
Gotcha,
The macro electrode, the big electrode that are used like in deep brain stimulation for Parkinson, for epilepsy, these are electrodes that provide stimulation, and some of them can record activity, not at single neuron level, but potentials, and those are more resistant to scarring, and that can probably operate on a long range. And some of them are essentially implanted for life. They're approved for chronic permanent use. Some of the DBS for Parkinson patient,
last for years and
replace
years.
the battery,
right?
But you don't replace the electrode itself.
Very interesting. When I first started making recordings from folks with intracranial implants myself, the procedures for implanting were extreme. Massive craniotomies, really taking off large parts of the skull and putting grids and depth electrodes in. We've moved way past that now with stereo EEG. So your experiences of the changes in the surgeries and how much easier it is, just give us a little insight on that.
Again, the technology, at least in our hands for the last 3 decades, has always been minimalistic in the sense that we put mainly, depth electrode, which are really pretty tiny. They're like, 1.2 millimeter in diameter.
Right.
And now, of course, the insertion technology is better now, with computations and with imaging that we can place them, better, maybe more precisely. There is another type of electrode which are subdural, which are larger arrays on the surface of the brain. And there you still need to really do a craniotomy to put it in, okay? But, if you are looking at technology which is developed in companies like Neuralink, that Elon Musk started the company.
Right.
The idea there is that if you know where you want to go, which in this case is a motor system, they do an opening like the size of a quarter, and then they can insert dozens and dozens of little threads, 40 micra each, it's done by a robot,
right,
and which can take a picture of the surface and can insert it without injury to blood vessels. So this is the technology, and then everything then is wireless, so everything is really closed. It's a closed system. You don't have to hook it up with a cable, every time. This is an engineering, feat. So I think this technology is going to develop, eventually going to be completely wireless, going to be minimalistic. But I think we still don't know how long the electrodes will provide useful signals.
Right. Yeah.
Because I don't think people have a long enough follow-up. I'm talking about the level of single neurons. Okay?
Right. Exactly.
You can do a lot, with EEG, with evoked potential. In epilepsy, for instance, to detect a seizure, you don't need to go to neurons. You can see that, in the EEG.
And they're large population dynamics
But if you want to get to the mechanism, how you remember things, what do you want and what do you remember? Every moment in life, right, you are positioned between your memories and your will or plans, right?
Yeah.
You're always at that little interface in the present. And, what is doing the magic is not you, it's your neurons.
Yeah,
right.
How interesting.
Of course, you will tell me that you are your neurons, and then we don't have a problem, right?
Exactly. We'll try not to do too much neurophilosophy.
Yeah, we'll stay away from that, yeah.
In terms of the way in which the surgeries have evolved, minimal skull breaching, robots, 3D reconstruction, do you worry about being out of a job? Will we do all of this with robots?
In terms of the robot, I don't know. I haven't had that level of anxiety. The question is, do you think AI can plan experiments and then it will, basically will all
Well, I mean really
redundant.
more in the clinical domain. I suspect we'll still need scientists to plan clever experiments, but
I mean,
but
it's
a routine
true,
surgery
medicine is going to become more and more robotic in a sense, and in this type of surgery, I mean, I don't think we'll get, we'll be out of a job.
Right.
I think, we will have to live with robots that we probably need to respect in some way, right?
Yes, yeah.
They'll probably demand respect soon.
Yeah.
And hopefully will not eliminate us,
In epilepsy surgeries, we do those, and correct me now if I'm wrong, really to get to the point where somebody is having electrodes implanted to map an epileptic seizure, to plan, where to go, where the neurosurgeon's got to go to remove diseased tissue or lesion tissue. There's a very high bar for that today. Do we do enough of them? Is there a large coterie of people out there with epilepsy?
Yeah, no, there's no
that
question.
Should be having surgeries.
There's no question that the number of people that we end up helping is very small compared to the number out there that can be helped.
Right.
And obviously, people have a natural fear from having brain surgery, and even neurologists may say, hey, let's try one more medicine. Let's try one medicine, but. At the same time, we need to realize that epilepsy is really a malignant disease in the sense that it has a major effect on a person's life, and
absolutely,
and sometimes can be life-threatening also. Okay, so I do think that the word needs to be more out there. That fear of brain surgery,
right?
Hopefully can be mitigated, and that's why we're talking about minimal.
Right, and that goes back to
that we only do minimal invasion of the brain really to get the information that we need and to essentially manipulate a circuit, because a network, the epilepsy is in a sense a network which has gone wild and creating electrical storm. It works still via electricity, but it produces, electricity which is not useful for behavior. In fact, it's counterproductive and sometimes risky, really, to life itself. Yeah,
it's a progressive disease too, right? In the sense that if you are having multiple seizures, there's more and more tissue becoming involved over time, and it's deepening its hold on that.
Basically, we see cognitive results. We see people who decline in memory, for instance, with seizures, coming from a certain area. There's probably a thought that some of this is neurotoxic to the brain, and especially, in development. When you have children who have, very frequent seizure, there's no question that it really have a negative impact on development, to the extent that sometimes even, if you achieve temporary results during development, you have 2 years without seizures, then the cognitive outcome can be totally different. Children who have those seizures, continuous seizures at these ages, they end up having irreversible, cognitive damage and no development. So they are doomed. Sometimes it's a very difficult decision, even in procedures like hemispherotomy, like even taking a whole hemisphere out of function, really disabling an entire hemisphere, because all what it does is producing, toxic, brain waves, which don't enable the person to develop. And sometimes it's even at the cost of a motor deficit. So, say, well, a motor deficit may be temporary, but a cognitive deficit will probably be permanent,
And this is really in the thick of it now, because these hemispherectomies, right? So for our viewers, this is literally removing half of the brain, taking one side out. And yet, if you do that early enough, the outcomes can be extraordinary, right? This is
absolutely,
if you take half of my brain or your brain out.
Diseases that affect the entire hemisphere, and you don't need today to remove it. You just need to disconnect it essentially, and not enable it to communicate with any other parts of the brain. Yeah. The result may be, a weakness on that opposite side, which usually, get much, much better. But then cognitively, you save the child really from being completely
and
retarded.
Doing it early, right? It's the plasticity of that child's brain allows for that. You disconnect half of our brain, and we're going to be hemiplegic, right?
If you do it obviously for a functioning hemisphere in an adult, it will have devastating results.
Right, but they have such plastic potential that even this extreme surgery, they can map around it. Let's get back to single neurons. Now, I know I'm going to get an eye roll out of you now, because this is probably one of those terms that you hate to hear now.
Okay.
But let's talk about the Jennifer Aniston cell. Okay. Tell us why we should or shouldn't be thinking about the world and that. You need to give people a little bit of background, but I suspect most viewers have heard of the Jennifer Aniston cell.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
No,
Okay. So, it got the Jennifer Aniston name because, National Geographic visited me, and I spent hours with them, and all what I got at the end was this cover, with 50 pictures of Jennifer Aniston. to get the 50 different, of course, right? To explain to the viewer, to the reader, the idea that indeed, it doesn't matter, how she looks, or whatever, Jennifer Aniston says, that's it, okay? And of course, we have shown it later. The reason we always, people, it's amusing, because they say, well, you are near Hollywood at UCLA, so all your patients are thinking about, Hollywood, stars. But of course, the idea behind it is that you see at the level of single neuron, you see an obstruction in which you really would not expect, okay?
Right.
That, because if you look at the visual system, for instance, and you look at what Hubel and Wiesel did, they found neurons which are specific to certain angles, and as you proceed, from this occipital cortex, to sort of, higher, more complex center in the temporal lobe, you see that neuron responds in a more global way. Okay, they don't so much care about the details. Okay, but then when you get to the medial temporal lobe, you really see something quite incredible. That the neuron itself really is capable of some incredible abstraction. It will get the idea of a person, okay, regardless, of, how that person looked on Wednesday or on Thursday, even the name written, or even the auditory signal from a person, the name spoken, essentially. All this is really getting the same response. It's like, on the one hand, it really gets to the core, to the identity of the concept. Okay. Right. But on the other hand, it's highly specific. So it's very specific, let's say, to a particular individual, that it doesn't care how that information is
what modality, what sense,
and there is a recent study, I forgot the name of the group, where they show that even like a banana, the sight of a banana, or the smell, or the name, so it even goes to olfactory.
Yeah.
Meaning that there's an amazing ability at the atomic level of the neuron. Of course, it's not just one neuron. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Another even very, very exciting study was really the memory, because not only you don't care about the modality, but even if you are locked in your own mind and there is no sensory input, and you just either imagine, as we have shown, or freely remember, there is no sensory input, right? So we have shown it, in science, and there, the glaring example was The Simpsons. It was a whole episode of 10 seconds, and the cell always fired just during, because we showed many videos, right? And only during that video, you see the cell just going berserk, okay, essentially. And that was in itself, I was kind of stunned when I saw it.
Yeah.
Because, you are on the UCLA ward, you're looking at a system with billion neurons, and you happen to lock in on one, and suddenly it reveals you. It's a process in science which is very rare.
Yeah. When
nature, so to speak, is presenting itself explicitly.
Yeah.
You don't need statistics, you don't need anything. It just says, here it is. And that is a level of understanding, okay, which we happened, to really hone in. But even more surprising was that when the patient was asked to just freely remember what she has seen, many episodes, and she said, oh, I saw that, and I saw Clinton, and I saw this, and I saw this. Men on the Moon, we showed all these videos, yes? Yeah. And then this neuron started firing, and she said, The Simpsons. So it's like out of nowhere, came this generated by whom, of course.
So she's just recounting the fact that she saw this video and the neuron is still saying hello.
So we established that was a concept neuron for the concept of The Simpsons, let's say. And then before she retrieved there in her mind, that neuron started ticking, essentially.
Yeah.
So it was prior to her conscious awareness that it was happening.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
What does it mean that we have access to a pre-conscious signal?
Right.
Right there, and I'm not talking yet about will, which is the other coin, side of this coin.
Because it does get after exactly how much we control anything, right? How much we're just controlled. Yeah. I could just imagine the editors at National Geographic, the glee, thinking, oh God, we can run a cover with a bunch of pictures of Jennifer Aniston. This is going to be good for business. But what an extraordinary thing. And I suppose another thing that we often talk about actually here on Neuroscience Perspectives is the communication of science to the lay public. And this is a really great example of that where it just catches the imagination and then it actually allows you to introduce some relatively complex concepts to folks about how the brain operates and how things are coded. So really good. Kudos to you on that front. Here, let me ask you a little bit more about yourself. You're a neurosurgeon, right? So you're practicing neurosurgeon, you're a clinician, but I mean, you can see it in you. You're a scientist to the core. I mean, you're discovery led. So how do you balance that, interest in science as a cognitive neurophysiologist with your clinical duties? What's that gemisch of things in your life?
I think this is really the core issue, meaning that the ultimate satisfaction is really being able to combine both, okay? And a sort of, we have all the time, mentors, and I'm thinking obviously about Penfield, who was this kind of combination that he was able to do this. His mind was really prepared for the science, because, he spent time with Sherrington, and then he went to Madrid and spent time with Rio Ortega looking at cells. Then he came to Montreal.
Give our viewers a little insight into the time we're talking about and who.
Yeah, so we're talking about, the 1940s. Here this guy, Penfield, who studies medicine, became a neurosurgeon at the time, which was really the beginning of neurosurgery. He was a contemporary, although younger than Cushing, and he got a Rhodes Scholarship. He went to United Kingdom and spent time with Sherrington, which was a premier physiologist of the time. And he really came under his influence. He said, "Well, I want to introduce this into the operating room." I think for me, really, the combination of doing something for a patient and then learning something from it, this is really the ultimate privilege. I think I'm sort of really feel privileged to have had this opportunity, but this is really what I wanted. I think, personally, doing just science, I very much appreciate the clinical context, and of course, as a clinician, I think we have an obligation to really ask, questions all the time. And Penfield always said, whenever you go into the operating room, you need to have a question in your mind. Okay, that is, and I think that in education of young doctors and young scientists, we need to really develop and really try to identify individuals who feel comfortable in both fields, Because, there is a price to pay, because you cannot sometimes go as much as you want deeply into science because you got a patient, okay?
Yeah, of course. That's the primary concern. Yeah.
And also, the scientific logic that works, for me, it's not like, as a pure scientist, you say, I am very much interested in memory, and I'll devote my life to studying memory. Okay, so I'll put an electrode here, and I'll put an electrode here, and I'll do optogenetics, and I'll do this and this, because my life is devoted to memory, okay? Yeah. We are different. We are opportunists.
Yeah.
Meaning, we got a clinical situation. Because, we don't put electrodes in to study memory. No. We put electrodes in to help a patient.
Yeah.
No question. The only thing that is the only goal.
Yeah.
But then when you are there already, you must ask a question. I mean, you cannot just, it's like...
Yeah.
So that is really it's a unique part, between medicine and basic science. Yeah.
Itzhak, your passion for this oozes right out of your pores. You can see it. I'm certain it's coming across on the video cast and that. How do you instill that passion in your trainees? And do they have it? And are we doing a good enough job of that?
I don't think we are doing enough, because a lot of pressure, on each side of this. In the clinical world, there's, a pressure to, produce more, to be more efficient, more productive, do more cases. The administrators is breathing down our neck more and more and more. And in science, of course, you've got a lot of pressures of being funded, We don't need to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
I saw, like 20 years ago, it was very difficult, because even, the scientists were very suspicious of people coming and doing something in the human brain, and they tried to say, well, you cannot learn anything from patients. But that has changed, and one big change was the Brain Initiative. And I must say, I was very pleased to see suddenly, I see at least it was about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I see a list, of young neurosurgeons which are applying for grants from NIH, getting, UO1 type of grants from the Brain Initiative. And there's really been a very positive move where, neurosurgeons, young neurosurgeons with interest were encouraged really and were given funds and were given the latitude and time to really pursue this. So that I hope, will continue because you need to give people an environment, that they can really develop.
Right.
Otherwise,
that's
they get
policy.
cornered.
That really, we need the body politic. We need government to weigh in
definitely.
and to provide the platform for that.
Definitely.
No
That's
question.
something that need to be planned, by government, by agencies. To really allow these people, because there are not many. I think who have this kind of dual passion, because you have to have dual passion.
Yeah.
You have to have passion for the clinical, and you have to have passion for the science, and it all needs to really fall into place in one context. Okay?
Right. And there has to be a fertile field for that to grow in anyway. I think I have only a few more minutes with you. We have a very busy day planned for you. I want to know about Itzhak, the boy in short pants. How you're world preeminent neuroscientist, no question about it, at University of California in Los Angeles today. When did you catch the science bug, and what's the path? I mean, I don't think there's that many kids getting up in the morning going, I'm going to be a brain surgeon.
Absolutely not. And in fact, people who tell us that they want to be brain surgeons from age 3, we usually don't take them. Which is something is suspicious here. It actually came pretty late in the sense that, I sort of started, in science.
Yeah.
So, getting a PhD first and from a very unusual path. And I think it's one other issue that you mentioned, developing a passion.
Right.
I think the concept of a mentor is extremely important. I realize it more and more and feel more and more guilty that I'm not a good enough of a mentor. But I'm saying, I was influenced by, Penfield on the one which was a virtual mentor, right? I never met him, of course. And another mentor, virtual mentor, was Cajal.
Right.
Cajal was just, and I happened, to start to really fall under the mentorship of two people who represented those two aspects. One, was Arnold Scheibel, who was a fantastic anatomist, but he was really using the Golgi to see the cells, and he always was thinking about function. Mm-hmm. And the other one was George Olgerman, who was a neurosurgeon who was like third generation to Penfield, because he was trained by a trainee of Penfield, okay? So I'm like fourth generation. I'm looking forward to see fifth and sixth generation.
Right. Amazing.
So this idea, I came to it from the science, but then once I did my PhD, in a neurosurgical environment, I said, I got to do it myself, this is what I want to do.
Right.
So that's where it all came together. So I didn't come, from age 3 saying I want to be a neurosurgeon or I want to be, a neuroscientist. It came late.
Amazing. And so you'd already gotten the PhD?
Yeah, I got a PhD there, and then, I said, okay, now I got to go to medical school, of course. So fortunately, I got accepted by Stanford, which was also a very open-minded place, you know. And then I did I did medical school a little faster because I had a lot of background, and then I did residency in another, place, Yale.
Yeah.
And then that's, how I actually fell into all this,
Superb.
Yeah.
Well, I think the world is better off for the fact that you're in this space.
Oh,
I'm very serious about that, and it's such a great pleasure to have you here at Rochester. It's
a pleasure
today.
to be
Thanks
here.
for coming on Neuroscience Perspectives. Second visit, exactly.
Second visit here, yeah. Hopefully there will be a third. Thank you. Okay.